الرسمية للمؤتمر هي اللغة الإنجليزية. يمكنكم الاستماع إلى الترجمة الفورية باللغة العربية من خلال أجهزة الترجمة. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Assalamu alaikum. How wonderful it is to see you on the second day of the IAEE 44th International Conference here in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, where energy has a home. I'm Rana Al-Hanaya, your MC for this morning. A little housekeeping before we commence. As safety is paramount, we are not planning any drills, but should an incident happen, the fire exits are located on both sides. You've got it here as well as there. As a courtesy, please set your mobile phones to silent during the interviews and meetings as well as forums. We remind you to participate and not just observe. This conference is a golden opportunity to network and, more than anything, have fun. There will be a time allocated for questions at the end. Please submit them by scanning the QR code on the screen at the time. There are 3 Wi-Fi networks available: IAEE Main 1, 2, and 3, and the password is exactly as the name for the network. There is also an app available for the conference, both iPhone and Android. It has the latest agenda, it has the speakers, it has the meeting room maps, so it's going to be very useful if you download it. The app is called the 44th IAEE International Conference. Surprise! And now, without any further ado, please join me in welcoming to the stage to deliver their welcoming remarks Fahad Alajlan, President of KAPSARC, His Excellency Majid Al-Moneef, Chairman of the Board, Saudi Association for Energy Economics, SAEE, as well as Jean-Michel Glachant, President International for the Association of Energy Economics, IAEE. President Fahad Al-Ajlan, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Rana. Good morning, everyone. Your Highnesses, Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, friends, and I see many friends here, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. A wise man once said, "Don't repeat yourself," so I'll try as much as possible not to do that. But I have to welcome some of you who were not with us last night and say that KAPSARC and the Saudi Association for Energy Economics are proud to host the 44th IEA International Conference here in Riyadh under the theme of Pathways to a Clean, Stable, and Sustainable Energy Future. This is the first time that the international conference is hosted in the Middle East and North Africa, and it comes at an opportune time, just between COP27, which was hosted in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, and COP28, which will be hosted in the UAE. The conference brings together academia, the scientific community, industry, and government to explore ideas and strategies that will ensure the long-term future success in a low-carbon emission future. The platform for dialogue and problem solving provided by the IEE conference will help inform and advise on the biggest challenges that we are facing today. And it pleased me to say that this is a truly international conference. Half of participants are from overseas, with the top 5 countries other than Saudi Arabia being the US, UAE, Egypt, United Kingdom, and Japan. More importantly and critically, and this is a target that all energy sectors leaders admire to and aspire to, is that 1/3 of the participation this year are women. It's incumbent on all of us to make sure that we have an inclusive target that drives inclusivity in our sector, both for the youth as well as for gender. We're all looking toward a future of prosperity which is not achieved at the cost of the planet. Will the future be the same future for all of us? And more importantly, is the starting point all the same? With 97% of the people without electricity concentrated in the least developing economies, we have an uneven energy access. The MENA region especially faces additional challenges of market volatility geopolitical uncertainty, and economic diversification. We have challenges of meeting ambitious climate goals, including net zero target, and lack of access of modern electricity and clean cooking to a significant portion of the global population, and supplying all the energy need for our economic activity. The net zero ambition should not come at the expense of economic development and improving the livelihood of all of those people on the planet. Securing dependable and affordable supply of energy continues to be a major policy goal for almost all countries. Securing demand at a stable prices also constitute a central policy aim for energy exporter. So we have both energy importers and energy exporters looking at issues of supply and demand security. The future of energy is also now closely tied to the availability of critical minerals and materials, water, and food. And these resources play a critical role in the global energy transition, as well as in drilling, transport, and distribution, including new forms of energy such as hydrogen. The COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted the fragility of global supply chain, and as demand for energy grows, so will be pressure on these systems. Transportation, for example, is one of the major pillars for achieving sustainability, yet there are major challenges and hurdles that need to be overcome. Demand for transportation will grow in coming decades, particularly in non-OECD developing countries, in pursuit of sustainability. And technological developments are the answer in some portion. However, changes in the way we plan, the way we act, the way we interact are essential. When we talk about energy efficiency, alternative vehicle drivetrains, fuels, automation, connectivity, and new mobility options, these are all solutions, but we need to make sure that we fit the jigsaws together. And also, when we talk about electrification is a major target, yet electrification cannot be the only silver bullet in our arsenal. When we're looking at energy poverty, the disparity in electrification is much more pronounced than overall energy poverty. And so while the power sector is crucial in achieving the energy transition goals, we need to be realistic and understand that electrification, while it might work in major economies and developed economies, it might be more challenging in new economies and developing markets. We're also facing a range of technological, economic, regulatory, and policy challenges. And the challenges of integrating renewable energy and energy storage, and introducing new focus and emphasis on nuclear technology, digitalization, and decarbonization. We need to diversify the economy, diversify our energy sources, and diversify the system and technologies that give space for innovation and create resilience. However, one issue stands above all: financing the investment that we need. Financing the energy transition towards carbon neutrality is crucial. However, what we have done in the past is not enough in terms of money and dollars. However, when we're looking at inclusivity and the dispersion of funds to emerging economies and countries that suffer from energy poverty, that equation is even worse. And so we need to focus on that as well. Inclusivity will be required for all clean technology to avert, abate, and remove emission. It will also require the cooperation of all players, governments, international financial solutions, and the private sector to pool resources and devise robust investment strategies. Finally, I would like to welcome all of you again to Riyadh and to KAPSARC, and I hope you will enjoy this conference and the hospitality of the kingdom, and encourage all of you, especially our young people, to learn from each other and educate each other, network, find innovative solutions, and thank you very much.
Good morning and sabah al-khair. The Saudi Association for Energy Economics is pleased and proud to be co-hosting the 44th IAEE conference. The Saudi Association has been in existence for the past 15 years, but it was relaunched and relocated from Dhahran to Riyadh the past 2 years. So we're very proud and pleased to that this event will be our main event in Riyadh. We have, the past year, we embarked on organizing this conference, and the journey was really exciting to be working with our partner KAPSARC and the IAEE. We used to have bi-weekly meetings with the IAEE and KAPSARC and all the stakeholders, barring the time difference and the weekends, different weekends. But we managed to come together. You'll notice that we have 11 plenary sessions and workshops. They all dwell around the carefully chosen theme of the conference that tries to capture the state of the energy landscape and the challenges ahead. When we were organizing, we had 3 objectives in mind. First, to promote the IAEE message and objective to provide a forum for the exchange of ideas, experience, and issues among professionals interested in the economic analysis of energy resources. The second objective is to advance the interdisciplinary nature of research of energy economics in the kingdom and the region. And I am pleased to announce here that we are actually in the process of instituting a MENA Energy Economics Conference annually in this region. We had one exploratory meeting in Abu Dhabi and Bahrain, but this will be hopefully institutionalized in the region. So the MENA Energy Economics Conference will join the North American Conference, the European Energy Economics Conference, and the Asian Conference. So we're very pleased to be part of this, and we have great partners in KAPSARC and others in the region. The third objective of the conference is that we try to make our best, and you've seen it last night, to have the attendees enjoy the Arab culture and hospitality and cherish their stay and experience in our country. Those are the 3 main objectives, and I hope the next few days we will have fruitful discussion and of the underlying issues facing the energy sectors. Throughout the planning of the conference, we were keen to engage many interested professionals and institutions in the kingdom and the region. That was reflected in our program, the diversity of our program, the depth of the program that you have it in front of you. The conference wouldn't have come about without the dedication of many reviewers of more than 400 abstracts we received, or the research capabilities from all over the world who submitted such abstracts, and many traveled to present them in the concurrent or poster sessions that you'll see them around, or without the contributions of the advisors from the region and the world over, who helped design a balanced and comprehensive program, or also of the 50 renowned speakers, panelists, and moderators in the plenary sessions. And last but not least, the dedication and enthusiasm of what we have been calling here KAPSARCans, whom I was lucky and blessed to have worked with for more than a year to ensure a successful conference. I wish a fruitful exchange and debate on the underlying energy issues facing the world, and also a rewarding visit from those out of the kingdom. I'd like also to express my deep appreciation to the King Saud University Press for printing the abstracts, and it's available for you outside. I also would like to thank our strategic sponsor, Saudi Aramco, for their forthcomingness and offer to host a large number of the attendees of what we hope will be a memorable tour on Thursday to the Sheba oil field in the heart of the spectacular empty quarter desert. So to all this, also I'd like to thank all the sponsors like our petrochemical giant, SABIC, and the other leading companies, the Saudi Electricity Company, Satorp, Yasref, and Aqua Power Antaka for sponsoring the event. I wish you all a good stay in the kingdom and fruitful discussions throughout the conference. Thank you.
Excellencies, ladies, gentlemen, dear friends. After the outstanding introduction yesterday by His Royal Highness, the Saudi Minister of Energy, it's a duty and also an enormous pleasure to warmly, publicly thank KAPSARC, a leading world research center and reference think tank, and its leader, Fahad Alajlan, as well as our IAEE branch, the Saudi AEE, and its leader, Majid Al-Moneef, for the excellent organization of our 44th International Conference, and I would like to join practice to the world. Of course, I will not forget the sponsors, the many sponsors, actually 7, a number which brings luck. Sponsors as Aramco or Aqua Power. In a minute, you will see all of them there. On a more, you have there. On a more personal touch, I'm also very, very happy to welcome being back to face-to-face events. And you will find this strange, to welcome you to Saudi Arabia. I know it's not my country, but I know. But you have all seen how easy now it is to get a visa and to go through airport practicalities. So I would like again to join a fact to this welcome to Saudi Arabia. We can understand each other only if we meet, if we speak, and if we welcome what has to be welcome. I would like to repeat my heartful congratulations for the quality of the program. I would add engagement with students and young professionals, which started yesterday, which is a remarkable initiative. And I would like to hear from you, our delegates, your feedback. You know, at IAEE, we encourage you to network, to meet fellow researchers, to share your knowledge, to gain from conference experience, and please, you will have to tell us what you have learned. All of us, we are lifelong learners, including me, I assume Daniel. We would like to know from you what you will learn today and take away for life. And after the event, please help us understanding you all, your own individual journey and experience through our post-conference survey. Good luck, very good luck to all of us and to Saudi Arabia. Thank you.
Fahad Al-Ajlan, Your Excellency Majid Al-Moneef, and Jean-Michel, thank you very much for the warm remarks. It indeed was a good welcome. Now we shall plunge deep into energy, volatility, security, and access. The importance of studying the effect of certainty in the energy sector grows more important by the day. This session aims to discuss the how of the creation of energy transition and the means that are more inclusive. Ladies and gentlemen, join me in welcoming to the stage the panelists for the plenary session led by Kaushik Deb. Our moderator is a senior research scholar from the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University. Kaushik Deb's research usually focuses on policies to achieve a just and efficient energy transition in developing countries. And before he joined the center, Kaushik led the Markets and Industrial Department's program at KAPSARC. Gentlemen, the floor is yours. Mr. Kaushik, would you please join us on stage?
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Let me also take this opportunity to welcome you to this conference and the first plenary session. From the agenda, it appears we are plunging headlong into the central theme that emerged from our conversations yesterday between Dan and His Royal Highness: volatility and energy security, and what ways we have to be able to manage that. The book award of IAEA to Bob's excellent account of how important market management is to mitigating volatility, and more importantly, the comments that His Royal Highness made about the pivotal role that OPEC Plus has made in maintaining stability over the last couple of years, I think provide us the sharp focus that we need for this particular session. The privilege that we have here is having possibly one of the most authoritative voices in the space of energy to come and deliver the first keynote address with what I think and hope will set the tone for the rest of the conference. Dan Yergin needs no introduction, and following on what Engineer Fahad Alajlan said, I will try and not do repetitions from yesterday. He is the Vice Chair of S&P Global, the Chairman of the Super Bowl of Energy, CERAWeek, and more importantly, the author of a series of blockbuster books, the latest being the new map, Climate, Energy, and the Clash of Nations, which truly, truly is a fantastic read, and I highly, highly recommend that. Without taking much more time, I invite Dan to deliver his keynote for the first plenary session. Welcome, Dan.
Thank you for that very nice welcome. Very pleased to be here and to join this distinguished audience. I know many friends, many people I've met over the years, many people who I don't know but whose work I respect. And in the phrase of Jean-Michel, glad to be here with all the other lifelong learners, which we all are. It's especially meaningful for me to be here at KAPSARC because, as I mentioned last night when I was with His Royal Highness, the Minister of Energy, I received a phone call from him in 2006 about setting up a think tank in Saudi Arabia, and that became an assignment which we, along with some of the others here, contributed to, and I know Adnan was part of that, Majid was part of that, the discussions to envision a think tank. And now here it is, not only a think tank, but one of the world's major think tanks, dedicated to excellence, with a culture of excellence. Its growth has been tremendous. Its contribution is a double contribution, one to understanding of energy in Saudi Arabia, to the goals of 2030 in Saudi Arabia, but also to the global understanding of energy. And this institution is very much networked with the global community of think tanks and other sources around the world. Indeed, its role is reflected in the fact that the 44th meeting of the IAEE is taking place here at KAPSARC. And I have to say, it's also very meaningful for me to be here, having been honored by IAEE maybe about 10 years or so ago. And I was very pleased last night to see Adnan and Bob and John suitably honored for their contributions to energy thinking. And I was thinking about the foundations of the IAEE, which was founded in 1977, which, if you think about it, was a time of energy turbulence and a time of energy uncertainty. And here we are in 2023, a new age of energy turbulence and energy uncertainty, and that really rededicates and refocuses the mission of the IAEE, all of you represented here, and all of you who are following it, streaming it around the world. What I wanted to do this morning is set out maybe 3 questions which will be used by our panel to help frame our discussion. And so each of these are in the form of a question. First, question I tried to get on the agenda last night, not with complete success. How has the oil market changed over the last year? And what does it tell us about world politics? Secondly, some of the key questions about the oil market in 2023, and I know Jeff Curry will also be taking up those questions. And then maybe a more complex set of questions about the energy transition and thinking it through properly. As to the first question, how things changed over the last year, I was thinking that over the last 30 years, we can pretty much say we've had a global oil market. Yes, there have been some exceptions, Iran, Venezuela, sanctions, but generally a flow of oil. I think it was quite surprising at the beginning of the Ukraine war for Americans to discover that the United States was importing 500,000, 600,000, 700,000 barrels a day of Russian oil, intermediate product, to make its refineries run more efficiently. And to me, that was a perfect example of an industry that was primarily geared to efficiency in terms of its operations. It was also, by the way, a global market in terms of the flow of technology and the flow of investment. No longer the case. What we have now is a divided oil market, or what I call a partitioned oil market, divided into 2. Russia, often described as an energy superpower, and that was part of the source of its power as a global power. But it's lost its brand as a reliable supplier. For 50 years, the Soviet Union and then Russia said, we are a reliable supplier. Politics will not interfere with the flow of oil or gas. Well, that ended almost a year ago, with the cutting off of gas supplies to Europe, which Europe, without realizing it, was the basis of its energy security. And that was a choice that Moscow made. And then the choice that Brussels made was that Europe would no longer import Russian oil. So that gave rise to the oil price cap, which was a perfect subject, it seemed at the time, for a graduate seminar in economics, because obviously it was not going to work. To say it was met with skepticism would be an understatement. But it was meant to solve 2 problems. One, it was indeed, from the viewpoint of those who were putting in place, to reduce the revenues going to the Russian government. On the other hand, it was to keep the oil flowing so that there would not be a shortage of oil, which would lead to a huge spike. And I think to the surprise of many, so far it's been working. It's worked really well for India, which imports 85% of its oil and has been able to buy oil at $45 or $50 a barrel. And it's one of the things, although it's not the only thing, that has made India a very strong economy this year. It's not been good for Russia, whose budget was based on $70 a barrel oil, and has been looking at oil selling at under $50 a barrel. But there are two near-term questions. One question actually is very near-term, because I think, isn't today February 5th? Okay, February 5th is the day that the ban on products goes into effect. $100 for high-quality products, $45 for low quality. And we'll see how that works, because about half of Russia's product exports also went to Europe. So it looks like it's going to work fine for at least a month or two, because stocks are so high, markets anticipate, but we'll see. The other big question is when China recovers and what the impact that will be on the oil market, and that will play out over a longer period of time. Now, this divided market is not taking place in a vacuum, because we are looking at a more divided world. In the new map, I talk about a movement from what I call the WTO consensus, World Trade Organization, where everybody's in globalization together. We're all benefiting from it. And I think that world started to ease away around 2015, 16, 17, and we've moved into this new era of great power competition. And that may seem, what does that have to do with the oil market? Well, any big geopolitical shift will affect the global oil market. Last autumn was a sign of pretty high tension. The Party Congress, the visit by the Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives to Taiwan, tensions were really rising. It looked like tensions were coming down. President Xi and President Biden met in Bali, and the Secretary of State, U.S. Secretary of State, was just about to go to Beijing when this balloon appeared. And as those who haven't kept up with the news may not know, it was shot down last night or this morning, just off the coast of the United States. And it reminded me of a historical event in 1959, 14 years after the end of the First World War. President Eisenhower and Soviet leader Khrushchev were going to meet at Geneva for a summit to really reduce tensions. But a U-2 plane was shot down over the Soviet Union, and the summit was called off, and it was a great setback for world politics. I hope that this balloon incident will not be something that sets back the effort to kind of bring more stability to this era of great power competition. But these will be strategic issues. These strategic issues will affect the world, and Fahad, Alajlan, in your remarks mentioned supply chains, and we can certainly see the impact on supply chains and how that will affect the industry. So let's turn to 2023 and just what to watch for in this year to kind of set the tone for our discussion. One, I will say, again, geopolitics, Ukraine. Where is that war going? It's certainly not going according to plan, because according to the Russian plan, the war was supposed to be over in 5 days. And the Russian soldiers brought dress uniforms to wear for the ceremonial parade in Kiev. But that parade did not occur. So where are we right now? Russian war aims remain unclear. The level of violence and attacks on civilians and infrastructure has increased. A major new offensive seems to be beginning. And I think if there's one thing to predict, it's the risk of escalation in this war. So I think where we are now, no one would have predicted a year ago. And I think we have to expect, as the minister said last night, for what happens next, again, the unexpected. And that will have an impact on energy markets. The second is the question of the global economy. And so much of the question of the global economy comes down to what's in the mind of Jerome Powell, the chairman of the U.S. Federal Reserve. The view is mixed. We do at S&P Global these PMIs that look at the economy, and they suggest a continuing deceleration in business activity, at least in Europe and the United States. But the speed of that deceleration is slowing. It appears that costs are coming down, which seems to hold out a better economic outcome. I know if any of you were at the World Bank IMF meetings last October, it was really pessimistic about the world economy. It's less pessimistic right now, somewhat more optimistic in it. But then, of course, the surprise comes. Most of you haven't followed this, but there was suddenly a much greater increase in jobs in the United States on this latest report than expected. But what struck me about it was not the report, and I don't want to get into the minutia, but what one of the economists said. And what one of the economists said, well, why were we all wrong? They said there tended to be a grouping in thinking. Everybody wants to see where everybody else is in their forecasts. And it reminded me of a study we did some years ago called The Perils of Prophecy. And the subject is, why are oil price forecasts often wrong? And you realize that part of it is it's a technical activity forecasting. There are a lot of uncertainties, but it's also a sociological activity, and it's also a psychological process. Some people are comfortable being outliers and not agreeing with the consensus, but for most of us, there's a tendency, you see that person thinks that, and that person thinks that, and one kind of feels more comfortable there. And so it's a kind of lesson, particularly for the young forecasters in this audience. But I would say in terms of the economy, just our S&P numbers, we've raised our GDP estimate for 2023 from 1.6 to 1.9% economic growth. Third big question is what happens to the Chinese economy? How fast is the recovery? How complete? Is it going to be faster than people think? And it's interesting to see the oil price oscillate in terms of whatever the latest news is out of China. A fourth thing to watch is government intervention in the economy. Here's a good example. The British government puts windfall taxes on North Sea oil production. What happens when they do that? Well, investment that was going to go into the North Sea instead goes somewhere else. So ultimately, the British government's revenues are going to be lower and less economic activity. So whatever the short-term political gain, it's actually going to cost more, but expect more government intervention. Got to talk about shale. People say U.S. shale's flattened out. We don't think so. We think this year U.S. shale will increase by 700,000 to 900,000 barrels a day, significant increase, even though there is that inflation in oil services there. Got to mention EV sales. We track them. In China, between January and October, 26% of new vehicles were EVs. So let's watch that. But let's also watch what the minister said last night. Remember what he said, for those who were there, about how the costs of initiatives for solar and wind are up 30 or 40% over a year ago, cost inflation. You're going to see that certainly in EVs, where the cost of lithium, and I know something that the KAPSARC looks at, those costs have gone up really dramatically. Finally, just a word on global upstream investment. It will recover this year to exceed 2015 levels, but part of that recovery is going to be the result of inflation and costs going up. And I know that the International Energy Forum and Joe McGonigal, the Secretary General, will be releasing the latest estimates on global upstream investment later this week, which we will listen to closely. The third subject I want to turn to is the one that is the big question, which is energy transition. I think that the last year means that people recognize that it's going to be harder and more difficult and more complex than would have been thought a couple of years ago, where you could just draw a graphic line. I recommend very strongly that you read the section in the new map about energy transition. I got really curious about energy transition because everywhere in the world you went, people talked about energy transition, so as though it was just a natural progression. Well, I went back and looked at it, and this energy transition is not like any other energy transition. I very boldly said that the energy transition began in January 1709, when an English metal worker figured out that you could make iron better using coal than wood. But these transitions unfolded over a century, and they are energy additions. Oil overtook coal. The world uses 3 times as much coal today. This is very different. This is trying to do something in a quarter century that took over a century otherwise. Also, something I'm just confused, and maybe somebody can explain it to me. How can you have the goal for 2050 be net zero when China's goal is 2060 and India's goal is 2070? And right there, you're looking about 30% or 40% of emissions. So maybe somebody can explain that to me during the coffee break. Well, let me summarize 4 big challenges to energy transition. And I outlined these in an article I wrote for the IMF. First is the return of energy security. Energy security, for the most part, had fallen off the table. Well, it's back on the table now. Look at Germany. Yes, it's going to accelerate its renewables, but what's it also doing? It has 5 LNG receiving terminals that it's building. Chancellor Schultz is flying to Senegal, he's flying to Qatar, he's flying to Canada saying, can you give me LNG? I think a process is going on about rethinking ESG from kind of the more simple-minded before. So energy security, big issue. Secondly, it's the size and the scale. You're talking about a $100 trillion economy that in 25 years you're going to change. I want to quote a comment by a French economist named Jean-Michel, very distinguished. He founded the Bruegel Institute, leading economic think tank in Europe. He wrote this paper for the Peterson Institute in Washington saying if you try and accelerate these 2050 goals into 2030, you could have shocks that would be like the 1970s. And I'm going to quote this because I think it's a challenge to the economists here. He said, climate action has become a major macroeconomic issue, but the macroeconomics of climate action are far from the level of rigor and precision that is now necessary to provide a sound basis for public discussions and to guide policy adequately. For understandable reasons, he said, advocacy has too often taken precedence over analysis. But at this stage of the discussion, complacent scenarios, let me underline that, complacent scenarios have become counterproductive. The policy conversation now needs methodical, peer-examined assessments of the potential costs and benefits of alternative plans for action. Well, that sounds like very much a call to action by the IAEE and its members around the world to address those issues, and look forward to the IAEE and its members taking that up. I think the third thing is the point really that Fahad Al-Zanian made in his introductory remarks, where you said net zero, but also economic growth. And it is the north-south divide which becomes more and more pronounced. We see it played out when the European Parliament denounces a pipeline being built in Uganda, and Uganda said, this is imperialism for you to do that. Your per capita income is 30, 40, 50 times higher than ours. How do you tell us not to have economic growth? And it is being played out. I did a dialogue with a group of African energy ministers, and I heard the same thing, the lack of climate finance, energy finance, which you referred to. And so I think there's a global north view, and then there's a global south, and the global south is 80% of world population, and its voice needs to be heard in this discussion too, because the needs of economic growth, poverty reduction, better health need to be met. The fourth one is the one, again, that Fahad referred to about supply chains and minerals. And again, it was striking to hear what the minister said last night about the increases in costs for renewable. We did a study on copper. We took copper because copper is the metal of electrification. It's the basic metal for it. And we took the 2050 goals from the US administration and from the EU and said, if you do that, let's look at every technology. What do you need for it? Electric car, 2.5 times more copper. Offshore wind, how much more copper? And basically you said, to achieve these goals, copper production has to double in about 15 years. What is the chance that copper production is going to double in 15 years? It takes 16 to 25 years to open a major tier 1 mine. 38% of world copper comes from 2 countries, Chile and Peru. In other words, copper production is more concentrated than oil production. And you can go through all the minerals, all the metals, and look at that. This is a real constraint, and it's kind of verbally recognized, but I think it really needs the quantification to go with it, the kind of work that we did on copper on these other metals to say, and by the way, how is this going to happen? So I think that's another issue in the energy transition, which we might call it the new supply chains for net zero. And by the way, those new supply chains happen to intersect with this other thing I was just talking about, great power competition. Think about that balloon that was just shot down. So it's going to be more complicated. So to summarize and provide, I hope, a framework for the discussion that's going to ensue, I had 3 questions I put out there. One, what is the significance of moving from a global oil market to a divided, a partitioned oil market, and what dangers lie ahead. After all, who predicted COVID? Who predicted a war in Ukraine? What's next? Secondly is, what are the key questions for supply and demand in 2023? And thirdly, the complexities of the energy transition and the need for deeper thinking and analysis. Deeper thinking and analysis, that sounds very much like the mission of the IAEE, and a mission that you all will participate in one way and the other. And so on the task ahead, I say to all the members of the IAEE, congratulations to you and best wishes of being part of this great endeavor to continue to understand the energy future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan, for that tour de force. I mean, there's just so much to unpack here. And as I said, we truly couldn't have anyone more authoritative to give us an account of where we are. And for that, and all your services in helping us understand energy markets, we are grateful. We have a fantastic panel for this session, so I won't take much time with introductory remarks. In ways more than one, as Dan described, perfect storm has hit the sector, with COVID upending much of the demand and capital spend on the other. Central banks everywhere increasing interest rates and reducing their balance sheets, and now the conflict in Europe complicating already tightened commodity markets and supply chains. The group that we have for the first panel of this plenary is the one that I would turn to make sense of where the sector would look like, what the sector would look like over the next few weeks, months, and years. So let's get this show on road. I will go in the order of panelists that are listed in the program and request each one of you to keep your comments to 7 to 8 minutes. To start with, Dr. Ibrahim Muhanna, the author of Oil Leaders, an inside account of 4 decades of Saudi Arabia and OPEC's global energy policy. Dr. Muhanna, I must say that with some pride, that the print of this book, just like Bob's book, is also from the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University Press. So as you can see, we have an eye for picking winners here. Dr. Muhanna is the vice chair of the Saudi Association of Energy Economics, was the member of the board of the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington, and the vice chair of the World Energy Council for Gulf States and the Middle East. He's been an advisor to 4 Saudi energy ministers since 1989. With that background, Dr. Muhanna, you would be able to give us a sense of the trajectory of oil markets over the past few decades and how market volatility has played out in the past, and what do you see the role of the Middle East in all of this? Dr. Muhanna.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for this nice introduction. I'm really happy to be part of this session and to be part of the whole conference. In 1988, His Royal Highness Prince Abdulaziz asked me, as well as other group from the universities, to join the Ministry of Petroleum. Before I accepted that for 2 reasons. It was a good offer on one hand, on the other hand, it's new challenges. Before I joined the ministry, I thought oil is a boring subject. It's not really exciting, it's static, and there is nothing in the oil to excite me. However, I took the challenge. It took me a few months, actually more than that, to discover that oil is one of the most dynamic subjects in the world. It's keep changing, and actually sometimes swinging. Look at, for example, the production. The production from different countries changing. In US, for example, okay, that went from 1985, it was 9 million barrels a day, and in 2005, it went down to 4 million. And now it's back to more than it used to be. I think it's the highest, to 12 million barrels a day. Demand keep changing. Look at China. China in the mid-90s was a major net exporter of oil. I remember we were visiting China and they said, we don't want to build refineries there because unless you are exporting oil, we don't need oil. Now they are importing something about 10 million barrels a day. They are the number one, the largest importer of oil in the world. The flow of oil keep changing as well. The best example, when after the Second World War, Europe wanted to rebuild and they wanted oil, and Saudi Arabia was increasing its production. So there is a good match between the two, and for this reason, Saudi Arabia built a pipeline from eastern province all the way to the Mediterranean. We built refineries in the Red Sea. Some people don't remember it or don't mention it. We give 2 concessions to European oil companies to explore and produce oils. Luckily, they didn't find it that time, but luckily, after they left, we find the oil and gas in these regions. Now, after in the 80s and 90s, Europe didn't need our oil because they have the North Sea, they have the Russians, or they have North Africa and others. However, things change, and we went back to what it used to be in the 60s. Right now, they want more oil from Saudi Arabia and the Gulf in general. Right now, we are increasing our export to Europe, especially products where they have shortages and the margin is high and the products is very expensive. We are going back to what it used to be in the 60s, not the same volume, but it is really changing the situation. The Russian oil moving from Europe to Asia with discount. So there is a change in this. It's very dynamic. Another aspect of changing board or oil or dynamic oil is the change in concepts and theories. In the 70s, as all you remember, it's the theory of exhausted resources, club of Rome, the limit to growth, and so on. And then in the 80s, when people start to talk about the end of OPEC, Then in the later on, people start to talk about alternative energies and the peak supply and then the peak demand. Now everybody talking about energy transition and zero carbon emissions. It is really changing, even it's not the oil market, it's also the concepts and the theories about the oil market. Other issues of affecting the dynamic or making the oil market is more dynamic is, of course, political conflict, like the Ukraine now, as well as management of supply, OPEC and OPEC Plus, and so on. Technology is playing a very important role. In such dynamic and changing market, it's very difficult to predict. Mistakes are common. So are bad judgment and misunderstanding. Look at what happened in last year, at the end of last year, when OPEC decided to reduce, or OPEC Plus to reduce the production by 2 million, everybody was stuck. They are politically motivated. They accuse us politically motivated. We are wrong, making wrong decision based on wrong information. Now, nobody talk about it. Right now, they realize that we were right, OPEC Plus was right, and it was a good decision. In the oil market in general, and in energy market in general, oil market in particular, we are keep changing and changing. Yet, since the Second World War, we have been more or less stable. Price goes up and down, supply from this country and this country go up and down, all these changes. However, all in all, stable. Even the major crisis, like after the invasion of Kuwait in 1990, where the world lost something about 4.5 million barrels a day, yet there is no big shortages or big problem. But I'm not sure right now about the future. I am normally optimistic, but I am not now as optimistic as I used to be about the oil market and its future. Why? Because emotions are gaining ground at the expenses of rational and realistic approaches, as Dan mentioned that. Some short-term political interests are getting more voices and stronger voices and tone, and people are targeting oil, not targeting emissions, as if oil the problems, while in the reality, the emissions, CO2 is the problem. But this is really part of the emotional process taking place now. At this point, let me talk something about Saudi Arabia. Well, I think, I mean, in Saudi Arabia, there is so many aspects of it, but I will just mention about our care about the environment. There is so many approaches we are taking care, we are taking right now regarding the CO2, regarding the global warming. We are increasing the production of renewables. By 2030, we will be producing something about 50% of our energy needs from renewables. Also, we are working to achieve zero emissions by 2060. Another issue about climate change is the advancement of His Royal Highness Prince Mohammed of greening Saudi Arabia, which is already started, and the whole Middle East. And this is really, as Prince Abdulaziz said yesterday, it's a great sink to deal with the environment and its protection. We are exporting more and more and producing more and more blue and green hydrogen. You are looking at me. I would like to conclude about Saudi Arabia by repeating what Prince Abdulaziz used to say, and he always say that we like to be ahead of the curve, and I think we are ahead of the curve in many aspects regarding the oil market as well as the environmental issues. Thank you.
Let me just take a couple of minutes and introduce all the rest of the panelists and kind of invite them all to join us up. Jeff joined Goldman Sachs in 1996 and was named the managing director in 2002 and has been a partner since 2008. He is responsible for conducting research and commodity market dynamics at Goldman Sachs. Over the years, his research team has been consistently rated amongst the best in the world. He himself was rated #1 by CNBC in 2011. Jeff, if you could join us in the panel here. Next, we have Bassam Fatou. Bassam is the director of the Oxford Institute of Energy Studies and professor at the School of Oriental and African Studies. He's an expert on all things energy, international oil pricing, OPEC behavior, energy transition, and economics of oil-producing countries. He is also the 2018 recipient of OPEC Award for Research and acts as an advisor to a number of governments and companies, especially in the region. Bassam, would you join us? Kobe van der Linde is the director of the Klingendale Institute of Energy Program, Klingendale International Energy Program since September 2011. She's managing various studies on European and international energy markets, security of oil and gas supply, and energy system transition. Between 2004 and 2014, she was a member of the Dutch Energy Council and has a distinguished career in the University of Linden and Groningen. Kobe, would you join us as well? And finally, Kenneth B. Medlock. Third is the James A. Baker and Susan G. Baker Fellow at the in Energy and Resource Economics at the Baker Institute, and the Senior Director of the Center on Energy Studies. He's also the Director of the Masters of Energy Program and holds adjunct professor appointments in the Department of Economics and the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at Rice, apart from having an extremely long history at the IAEE as well. Let me kind of start with Jeff here. With everything that you've heard, Jeff, now, and everything that we kind of know about the fact that there's not enough investments that are happening in the oil and gas business, the fact that we've had now spare capacity issues, not just in oil, but now in gas as well, and the fact that these investments don't seem to be on the horizon. And on the other hand, any energy outlook predicts some form of peak oil, the latest being BP's energy outlooks that came out last week. Making all of this a lot more complicated and noisy is this discussion around short cycle and long cycle investments. What do you think? Does this work? Does this help volatility? And are we locked in a world of boom and bust?
We definitely argue that we're in the middle of a commodity supercycle. And what I want to do is really define what a commodity supercycle is, and it can answer, I think, most of those questions in that context. A commodity supercycle is simply a CapEx cycle. We saw one in the 70s, we saw one in the 2000s. There's nothing mysterious about it. Why do you need a CapEx cycle? You run out of physical capital. And we're at that point. And you know, I think as Dan pointed out, copper's part of the energy complex now. And when we think about running out of physical capital, we're running out of everything that is physically related, whether if it is energy created by gas, oil, coal, basic metals, agriculture, and the rest of them. And another important point I want to emphasize here is we talk about oil like it's separate and distinct. You know, we look at the commodity complex, they all arbitrage one another, whether if it's corn, sugar, you know, copper with PPC piping to the plastics, and right now we look at, you know, gas prices, BTU. A lot of these things are locked in with one another. So when I like to think about energy, it's really broader commodities. And on that point, I've really come to the conclusion there's two types of commodities. Organic commodities, ones with a carbon-hydrogen bond, and inorganic commodities. And let me remind everybody here, what is food? Food is a carbohydrate. And when we think about what is oil, it's a hydrocarbon. Only thing separating the two is an oxygen. And so that's part of the reason why these things are locked in. So with that said, what's driving that underinvestment? And I want to go back to the point here about, you know, Dan made as, you know, we look out at 2050, 2060, 2070, whatever on this. This is that focus of the market on that is no different than crypto, tech stocks, clean hydrogen. It's pie in the sky stuff that doesn't impact today. If we're thinking about what impacts today, that's the physical world. Green hydrogen, ESG, all of it is the financial world. And I want to go back to these commodity super cycles and this CapEx cycles. Let's don't look at oil and commodities. Let's look at what happened in between. 1960s. What was the 1960s? It was the nifty 50. Low and stable inflation, extremely low interest rates. Investors chased duration, that pie in the sky stuff. What was that pie in the sky stuff back then? It was brands, Coca-Cola. Did investors care about Exxon and putting drill bits in the ground? Not even. In 1968, that changed. Let's go to the 1990s. Sounds very similar, doesn't it? Low and stable inflation, low interest rates. What did investors chase? They chased the dot-com boom. They preferred Microsoft over Exxon. 2010s, low and stable inflation, low interest rates. What do investors choose? This time they wanted the FANGs. Facebook, Apple, Amazon, all of them over the Exxons of the world. And when I say Exxons, BHP, Rio, Saudi Aramco, all of those things that impact today. And so when we think about this underinvestment, this is what's driving our bullish view on commodities. And I don't want to say it's just plain ESG or plain a focus on, I think all of these were due to low interest rates. As in, you can think about what happened. We run out of capacity. What do rising interest rates tell you? Put money into the physical world. And that's where we are today. We need to take money out of the financial world, put it into the physical world, and start growing that capacity to debottleneck the system. And the higher interest rates are just part of this broader story. Oil's going to be a part of the mix. We can talk about energy transition a little bit later. But I think the key message here, we're entering a CapEx cycle. I don't care if it's oil, gas, aluminum, copper, corn, wheat, you name all these different commodities. We need investment there. And what we need, and the higher interest rates are telling you, put money into the physical world, not the financial world. And so when we think about commodities, commodities are the physical world.
Thanks, Jeff. I mean, that's truly helpful for us to be able to understand exactly what volatility is in this particular context, especially where we've been over the last 18 months or so. Bassam, if I can kind of change tracks with you a bit, could you give us a sense of the energy trilemma and what...
Hold the mic closer.
Sorry. What that means with the current energy crisis, especially as Fahad also was talking about earlier, this north-south divide and how developing countries and how the current environment is affecting their ability to attract finance and manage the issues around energy security, transition, access, all themes for this session.
First of all, I'm really delighted to be here today and joining such a distinguished audience. And I would also like to thank KAPSARC for hosting us and for superb organization of this event. So thank you, Dr. Fahad and your team. I think, as has been mentioned many times, when you talk about energy policy, it's very much multidimensional. And it tries to achieve multiple objectives. It's about sustainability, it's about energy security, it's about affordability and access, even in developed countries, because high energy costs tend to hit households' income, particularly those on low income brackets, particularly hard. And for some countries, it's about industrialization strategy, and it's about also promoting the role of the real economy. And I would say, as Jeff has mentioned, that Europe generally, but more generally policymakers, lived in a very benign world. We have robust growth rates, we have low inflation, low interest rates, we had globalized supply chains, we had abundance of energy and relatively cheap energy. And as a result of that, what we have seen is that security and affordability fell in the priority of the policy agenda. And of course, this changed all with the Russia-Ukraine war. And all of a sudden, in addition to sustainability, security and affordability became key drivers of energy policy. And of course, when you have multiple objectives, there is bound to be trade-offs. And I think what the energy crisis basically have shown, that we have some trade-offs which have become very clear. So we have seen substitution from gas to coal, we have substitution from gas to diesel, and that has increased greenhouse gas emissions. We have also seen Europe trying to diversify its energy sources, particularly when it comes to gas, moving away from pipeline to LNG. Of course, the long-term objective is to try to reduce dependency on gas, but at least in the short term, we see this trend to diversification intensifying. I think the other important implication of this shift in the balance of priorities is that we have seen the swing away from markets towards more government intervention. So we have seen governments introducing support packages to try to offset the impact of the shocks on consumers and producers. We have seen the introduction in some countries of windfall taxes, solidarity contributions, and this is really, impacting very much the investment environment. Actually, I've seen even nationalization of some of the energy assets in some countries. And in the gas market, for instance, we have seen the introduction of the price cap and even, joint gas purchases, which is going to reverse decades of market liberalization in Europe. And we are seeing calls for redesigning of the electricity markets. And to me, the impact of all of this is increasing policy uncertainty, and it's also impacting the operation of markets, and some of the markets that are very mature, such as the oil market. And as been mentioned before, we are seeing much more segmentation where the prices of discounted and discounted crudes operating completely differently. We are seeing longer trading routes. We're seeing the cost of optimization. And to me, this is certainly a policy risk. So we have seen a swing, and to me, the big question is how long this will last. Will there be more government intervention when there is realization that the climate targets have not been met? Have we seen the peak of government intervention. And to me, the question is not. We're likely to see more government intervention. This is likely to last. And that brings me to the final observation that I would like to make here, is that when we're talking about energy markets, it's very important to remember the interconnectedness of market. And that's why it's very important to focus on the developing countries in particular, because what we are seeing as a result of the energy crisis is that it's making energy, particularly energy, much more expensive for other countries in the world. And if you combine this with the fact that many developing countries are finding it extremely difficult to access markets, financial markets, and given the level of developments of the local financial market is quite limited, this is actually could enter in a reinforcing trap, what I call the reinforcing trap, because what we're seeing is that these countries have limited access to financial markets, the cost of finance is going up, which means that their ability to finance clean projects has reduced, which means their resilience is going down, which means that the cost of borrowing is going to go up, which means they're not going to be invested in the technologies that are needed to make that transition. And on top of that, what we're finding is that many of those developing countries, particularly in Africa, are seeking to invest in hydrocarbon projects, but because of the ESG movement, actually they're being very much restricted. So they find themselves in a very, very reinforcing and unhelpful trap where they don't have access to finance clean projects, at the same time do not have access to finance hydrocarbon projects, which is needed in order to enhance their access and also their energy security. So that's why when people talk about the energy transition fastening in Europe or going at a higher speed, it might be the case that it goes in Europe, but I think in the rest of the world is going to proceed very differently. And that's why it's very, very important when we talk about the carbon border adjustment tax, the Inflation Reduction Act, the move away from hydrocarbon is to also take into account the perspective of emerging economies and developing countries and not only see it through the lens and the perspective of the global north.
Thanks, Bassam. I mean, that's a really interesting perspective, especially to me it sounds that a lot of that policy intervention and policy choices that governments are making, particularly in Europe, are truly having a global impact despite globalization not being a thing anymore. And I mean, this is something that Kopi, perhaps I can ask you to weigh in as well. Do you think Europe has finally made up its mind about energy security versus energy transition? Where does Europe sit here?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And thank you for having me in this panel to share some thoughts with you. I think Europe might be in balancing between every time there is a every time there's a crisis, we tend to the immediate action is to increase our targets, which makes me feel very uncomfortable because the likelihood of you actually achieving what you set out to do is declining rather than increasing. And in the current crisis, we've seen something similar. Within a week of the Ukraine war starting, we were told as citizens of Europe that the remedy for the crisis in our energy security was the energy transition. Of course, in the long run, that is probably true. But in the short run and in the medium term, people are really wondering how Europe is going to go about it. And the danger of being I mean, it's good to be ambitious and to want to invest in this new thing. I fully agree with that. And we've been working quite a lot on hydrogen carriers and thinking through how value chains of the future could be built. But that doesn't take away from the fact that Europe, when they liberalized its markets, they did so without accompanying security of supply policies in place. When they tried to fix that later, they did it only for consumers. So now we have this silly situation, and I'm sure some traders are elated with what they fixed up in some countries, among which mine. That we have a price cap for consumers because they couldn't afford the bills anymore. People are, I mean, just as an anecdote, when I arrived here, I realized when I was showering in the facilities here that I could actually stay in perhaps longer than a 3-minute song. And that maybe even your country would allow me 2 songs. I still can't make myself to not think about it. And that is what has changed. We have a lot of elder people who are so afraid, and I think this is something that Saudi Arabia understands much better than anything. It's not exactly the size of the bill, but the unpredictability of the bill or the income that is creating a lot of trouble. And so a lot of the elderly people who are on pensions, who haven't increased, they don't dare to turn on their heating in winter. And since these people have a harder time adjusting to temperatures, we see a lot of admissions in hospitals of elderly people who are actually undercooled. And so the government is fixing that with a price ceiling, but of course what happens that energy traders will, now that they know that there is a secure price, they will send the most expensive part of their portfolio our way, because that's a clear win-win situation. And of course we cannot afford to do these things for more than a year. I think is already, if you look at what it potentially could cost, we cannot afford it as taxpayers. So the question is what they're going to do, and I don't think they really know what to do. And the second part of the crisis, by focusing on consumers, what the European policy making demanded, is that we have totally forgotten about the competitiveness of our industry. And then I go to the energy transition. Any hopes we had and what we were preparing for was actually the type of development where the first projects for blue and green hydrogen carriers to be taken, among which from this country, would rely on the long-term contracts with industries that will have to either had to balance, they pay a lot for the CO2 tax, or they can avoid that by using low carbon energy carriers. The uncertainty in industry at the moment, whether they, with all the interventions that Bassam and Jeffrey already, or Jeff already mentioned, I'm not so sure industry in Europe feels secure enough to sign these long-term contracts. And if they don't, I cannot see, and maybe someone over a cup of coffee can explain to me, the policymakers say, we want to earmark our electrolysis hydrogen for heavy trucking. You can't build a value chain for the first 3 trucks. It doesn't work that way. We need volume, and only industry can build us that volume, and then we can supply the heavy trucks, the first 3, the first 50, the first 100. That's how it works. And it's this lack of understanding of how the dynamics work of value chain building. We know how it's done in oil. We've seen how it's done in LNG. We understand the principles. And because of ideology in Europe, we cannot apply them. And that means that we might be kicked back rather than from an ideological leader in the energy transition into a pragmatic follower on what Japan is developing, very interesting, this country is doing, but also what is going on in the United States. And I really hope that I'm wrong in the sense that I hope Europe can also contribute to these new technologies, because that hopefully makes it also more affordable for the emerging markets to catch on. But I do have my doubts about the way we've been doing it so far, and this clash between ideology of energy transition and pragmatically looking at how it's done, how we do it, and not just focus on 2050, but actually how are we going to get there? No one wants to study how to get there. And when you get there, you need to think about how do we manage the predicted shrinking of the fossil fuel economy, because that's going to be a very irregular process if we don't watch it. And so we will create a lot of trouble for ourselves without having the promise of a success on the energy transition, and we have the promise of maybe a lot of volatility in what we know today. So I think we need to focus on value chain development and how it works, and look at how you get there, not just present me with studies on life in 2050. I'm old, yeah? That, I know I need to focus as far away as 2030 to try to achieve that. And then what will that kind of dynamics provide us with? And I really hope that the young people are not just living in 2050 and 2023, but they can live in 2023 and work on the stuff that we need towards 2050. Thank you.
Thank you, Kobe. Again, one of the things that Kobe mentioned allows me to now complete the world, the US. A big missing piece of the conversation that we've not had as yet today. The US played a great role in terms of making sure that lights stayed on in Europe all through last year by supplying these enormously large volumes of LNG, becoming the world's largest LNG exporter. But now there is this new robust industrial policy focused on energy transition in the form of the IRA. What do you think this does to market volatility, not just for fossil fuels now, but everything energy transition and green going forward?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I'm glad to be here. It's great to see a lot of old friends. It's fantastic to be in person. I think that can't be said enough, to be blunt. The industrial policy movement in the U.S. is more than just the IRA. It's also the bipartisan infrastructure law, or the IIJA, however you want to refer to it. But really what you see are two mechanisms providing direct funding through appropriations, as well as indirect through tax subsidy support. So a lot of incentive in place to really expand low carbon infrastructure, however you want to frame that. What's missing even in the United States, however, from this discussion is the role that market design plays. And I feel really comfortable saying this in front of this audience, being it's the IAEE, but oftentimes we leave that out of discussions. It gets very heavily focused on what do we need to do to fund infrastructure development. Well, infrastructure is necessary for liquidity and transparency, but it is far from sufficient. So you really need to tackle market design. And I'll give you a couple of little anecdotes to sort of prove the point. But if you go back to the United States natural gas market, which is one of the most efficient commodity markets on the planet, number of liquid pricing points, tremendous transparency. That transparency, however, wasn't an act of voluntary cooperation, right? It was actually an act of regulation. So FERC Order 636 mandated that all pipeline operators post on an electronic bulletin board information about volume and price. So when you have that kind of transparency, it enables a lot of activity that doesn't otherwise exist. It promotes the development of clear messaging that markets provide, which is price. Ultimately, if you're going to invest in a space, you need to understand price, you need to understand differences in price locationally. That actually drives the investment activity. You see that in spades in the US natural gas market. Permitting is an issue that has arisen to the top, but I'll say this, even given the difficulties we see in the United States right now around permitting pipelines and such, it is still one of the easiest places in the world to do business. So we've got to keep that in mind as well. But I mentioned the US natural gas market because many of you don't know this, but everybody's probably heard of Henry Hub, right? It's the most liquid natural gas pricing point in the world. The infrastructure for Henry Hub has been in place since the 1950s. The first liquid trade did not occur until the early 1990s. So you have to ask yourself the question, why? It's because there was no transparency. That didn't happen until you actually had some very insightful and tremendous policy that was laid down beginning with the Natural Gas Policy Act in '78, creation of the FERC and several FERC orders that culminated ultimately with 636, which unbundled the system. Guess what's happened since? So if you compare 1978 to the current gas market, there is roughly double the amount of pipeline mileage in the United States. Gas production in 2000 was around 19 BCF a day. Today it's around 37 BCF a day. And I asked people the following question: if we hadn't had that, would the shale revolution have happened? No, there's no way. Because that transparency allowed individual small market operators to access a market that they would otherwise have no ability to access. So The brilliance of that is the market design. We've got to start talking about that. Because if you want to actually promote growth in new energy technologies, incumbent energy technologies, market design is critical, and I don't see it. We actually just published some work on hydrogen. And this is actually what I was talking with Dan about this yesterday. This is what we focus on in that work. We reviewed 27 different regional and national hydrogen strategies when we did this work. Only 2 address market design. That is a road to nowhere. Just going to be very blunt. One is in the port of Rotterdam, which is heavily located within the boundaries of the port. The other is the National Hydrogen Strategy of Australia. Everywhere else in the world, they talk about hubs, they talk about infrastructure, they talk about how do you build things, but there is no discussion of market design. There is no discussion of regulatory architecture. And I'm going to challenge everybody in this room as part of the IAEE, if you're going to make a big impact on this discussion, that should be your focus. So just to highlight this and bring it home, I know we're kind of tight on time, but one thing I want to share is just a little anecdote. Some of the work that I've done with one of my colleagues here, Peter Hartley, is focused on the economics of innovation. Sort of what leads to new technologies being adopted. And this is something we often just kind of sweep under the rug and assume it's going to happen, but if there's enough funding in place, that's not quite right. There's this thing called the Valley of Death. So imagine you're a professor at a university, you come up with this new widget manufacturing process in your lab, and it's the greatest widget manufacturing process that exists. And it can do everything at half the cost you see in industry. Hopefully this sounds familiar to a lot of people, but so you say, I'm going to take this out, I'm going to patent it, I'm going to take this out into the market, and it's going to sell, and I'm going to be really rich, this is going to be game-changing. My university is all in with me because they're going to get a portion of the IP because they helped sort of develop all this by financing my lab. I go out into the industry and I try to sell this to a procurement officer, and they look at it and say, well, this is really intriguing. Let us take it in-house and look at it for about a month. They come back 30 days later and they tell me, we're not going to adopt this. And I'm struck. So I don't understand. And I might even write a book about conspiracy theories and why this didn't get off the ground. Here's the problem. What I didn't account for was the fact that my technology would require the dismantling of the entire set of supply chains that support the existing production facilities that are currently in operation. That represents a massive fixed cost barrier to entry. And I did not think about that. So when we think about new technologies and energy transitions, I've been lecturing a lot on the complexities of transitions. This is something I've been talking about for about 5 years now, and gets into coordination theory, supply chain development, the economics of technology adoption, the fixed costs of adoption. We all have to be thinking about all these things, and market design is a central piece of that discussion. Thanks.
Thanks, Kit. That's a really useful perspective to have. We're going to have a few minutes for Q&A, and I'd kind of encourage you to get your creative juices, your intellectual juices up and running and start submitting questions so that we can kind of start coming to those. Dan, if I can just ask you to just come back on this last point that Ken made around market design and transparency. I mean, 2 of the biggest interventions that you've seen in energy markets, the price caps in December and the historic day that we have today. Where do these all sit? Because it does not appear that we have enough data, information, or ability right now to be able to figure out whether there is an effectiveness around these policies, the realization of their objectives, and what impact that they'll end up having.
Well, I think the result has been that they're having a bigger impact than had been anticipated. I think it was generally seen as very odd to have a price control system imposed on a commodity coming from one country. But in fact, it's worked. Obviously, this is an exigency. People do things in wartime that's different than you do another time. And this is a wartime measure about the funding for the war in Ukraine. So we'll see how it works with products. And as I said, if Chinese demand comes back strongly, will that challenge the market? But so far, it's working. Can I ask a question from what Jeff?
Please.
Yeah. So, Jeff, can you elaborate? I mean, this has been a great discussion. I've actually been making notes what everybody's been saying. Jeff, can you elaborate on the relationship between interest rates and the cycles? higher interest rates, wouldn't that impede investment in infrastructure for energy, or I guess you said it's the physical market versus the financial market.
Why are interest rates high today? They're high today because energy prices exploded, drove up inflationary pressures. And so the higher interest rates are telling you physical capital is getting a better return than financial capital. And that's just, and I know it sounds bizarre, but another way to think about it, when interest rates are zero, crypto sounds great, doesn't it? When interest rates are 5%, crypto's a disaster. And by the way, I don't want to be dismissive of energy transition or anything. Clean tech, like green hydrogen, has been trading just like crypto. That's the reason why I lump it into that exact same category. And so when we think about when interest rates are really zero, all you care about is net zero 2050, unprofitable tech, some type of new technology that's going to change the world, because you don't care about today. As interest rates go higher and higher and higher, you start to care about the today. Go back, last year, emissions are going to be up 4.3% because of burning so much coal globally. And so what we observe is that the market was more focused on that long term as opposed to the near term. But now they have higher interest rates, they're going to have to make choices. And what did we observe last year? When energy transition or be green has a cost with higher interest rates, what did they choose? They chose to be dirty, which that's a whole nother point. But I think that to answer Dan's question here, and that's really critical, is that the higher interest rates are telling you need to do something. Why didn't we do something? I'll tell you what the investors, 3 reasons why we didn't do anything. 1, this industry, energy in particular, it is a bad industry. It destroyed 54 cents on every dollar given over the course of the last decade. In the 1990s, 27 cents on every dollar. I don't know the number to the 60s, but it was bad. That's the reason why people chase the duration. But part of the reason, 50s invested too much commodities, 60s. And then too much commodities in the 90s and too much commodities in the 2010. So I think you get the point. But I just want to hammer it home is that, we didn't make investments, poor returns, volatile prices, and then you can put ESG on there. And the higher interest rates are telling you, you got to do it now. I hope, does that make it clear?
Thank you. I think, by the way, your question to me, maybe you want to try it on the other. I mean, I offered one view on.
Absolutely. Bassam, you want to weigh in?
Just a follow-up, because it's very important also to emphasize developing countries' perspective and emerging country perspective, because what we're seeing is the cost of borrowing for those countries have increased quite dramatically.
Put your mic a little closer.
And the cost of borrowing for developing countries has increased quite dramatically. And the fact that the local financial system is very much underdeveloped. And I think political risks have increased, currency risks have increased, and that is going to even make it more challenging to fund any type of project, whether it's clean or hydrocarbon projects. And I think when we talk about the energy transition and decarbonization, and the fact that most of the emission reduction is going to come from these countries, this is actually central to the debate, general debate on the global energy transition.
Dr. Muhanna, if I can come to you just for a second. We've talked a lot about the choice of policies that Europe has made or what the US is doing. We are in a very interesting part of the world where government's policy choices kind of have impact on what happens in oil markets. We've had the conversation around OPEC plus managing oil markets, but also the fact that governments here, particularly in Riyadh, are able to deploy large amounts of capital to solve challenges around hydrogen, around carbon capture. Could I request you to just give us a perspective on that?
Well, I strongly believe that the oil market and the oil will continue with us for many years to go. And I think one day the argument that we have to cut the emissions, CO2, more than cutting the use of oil, will prevail, will continue. Another point which I believe is as energy, different type of energy are linked. What happened to the oil market or oil prices will affect other sources of energy. And we have seen it when the prices of oil was low. Many projects in Spain and Morocco and in California, solar projects, disappeared. So they are linked. If the prices tomorrow collapse, will affect negatively other sources of energy. So the relationship is very clear. The point of developing countries, especially developing countries, especially in Africa right now, they are having so many problems. The interest rate, high interest rate, affecting negatively their currencies. The drop in the currencies of many countries and developing countries. Besides that, the energy itself. I mean, the poor people need more and more. It's not really luxurious things as it's happening in the rich country. So they are all, linked together and working in the same direction, even though people might not recognize that. But in the end, we will go, we are in the same boat and we are going to the same direction.
Thank you. I thought I had the most enviable job of managing this panel in the sense that I just had to sit here and glow in the enormous amount of knowledge that comes from this panel, but I also have the unenviable task of calling this to an end. I recognize that the organizers are going to chase us off the stage if we don't finish now. Thank you all very much. We'll have a chance to have these conversations over the next few days, tea, coffee, everywhere that you can grab these really clever minds. Please do so. And thank you all very much for joining the panel today.
Thank you very much for a stimulating conversation and an engaging Q&A session. Ladies and gentlemen, now I'd like to invite you to join us for the coffee break outside. And don't forget that we have concurrent sessions as well afterwards. For that, you can check the agenda on the website or check the application. Thank you very much.